when an immigrant comes here to our country, they can appreciate the freedom that we have. And he did. And he was very, very much an Americophile.
When he came to this country, he chose July 4th as his birthday. Since you always have a holiday, when you're Jewish, you have a holiday connected with your birthday, and he wanted to be really American, so he chose July 4th. He loved America. He loved it. He couldn't believe the level of freedom he found here when he came. He couldn't believe how Jews could really live in a country that accepted them, where they would be accepted the way they were. It was marvelous for him. He just loved it. And when anyone criticized America, or if they became a communist because there would be a better way to do it here, like communism, he would scold them, but really hated the idea that anybody would compare the United States to Russia, which he thought was just the most horrible place he knew of.
And he used to tell us one little story. He said, America and Russia are very different in one respect. And I'd say, well, what was it? I heard the story many times. What was it, Papa? He'd say, well, when it comes to building a railroad, both countries are terribly corrupt. He said the difference is that in Russia, the railroad never gets built, and in the United States it does. And bear in mind that when he came here, he'd been trained to be an Orthodox rabbi. And here in Auf eigene Drochem, he writes about himself, I left home when I was 13 years old. For almost 5 years, I wandered from one Talmudic academy to another and lived practically on a dole. At the age of 18, I arrived in the United States and went through all the drudgery and privation of the immigrant. I began to earn a living at the age of 30. I bought my own home. It was a great emotional experience. My own piece of land and my own home. True, a small lot of ground, 20 by 100, not much of a backyard. There was room for one tree only. The garden in front had room for one peony. I planted that. On this piece of ground, my home, this is where I would always find a spring of living waters. Every night when I returned, my children were there waiting for me. The house and its fullness, all of it, was an entity by itself. She, his wife, the children, the accumulated modest possessions, my steady hunger for her, my delight in the children, all these were a reflection, an actual emission of eternal, absolute reality. So there you have him in full bloom as a secular Jew, absorbed in the reality of life in America. And what a change from the way he was raised.
I remember their house in Brooklyn, which is the house where my mother grew up. I went back there one day to look at it a couple years ago. It was interesting to see the neighborhood.
It was a little detached on both sides brick house in Brooklyn. It had a little stoop in the front that we used to play stoop ball on, actually, and a little garden in the front.
It was Flatbush, and I remember walking in and there was a foyer, like a little vestibule, and you'd come in, and then there's the living room, and they had the big old TV, like black and white TV. Then to the side, there was an area with a bay window. He had his desk there. He would always be working there. He always watched the news, so there's always that 6 o'clock news on.
Most of the time that I remember, there was a table in the living room that was his desk. Then later he set up an office in the basement, but it was basically in the middle of the house that he sat down at his desk, and that would be like, by this time, 8, 9 o'clock, and he'd work till 3, 4 o'clock in the morning on his writing. The desk hardly could be said to hold what he was doing there.
Of course, there was a library downstairs in the basement of a most elaborate Jewish library with a lot of Talmudic materials.
There were just walls, like shelves, and every shelf was filled with all kinds of books, and they were Yiddish, Hebrew, English.
The kitchen was in the back of the house, so when you first walked in, it was like the library area, if you will, kind of.
He'd have his desk in the front by the window. When we would have seders there, it would take up there was really two rooms kind of in a rectangular shape, deep. And you'd have the first room and then the second room. But they would have a table the size of both rooms, and my grandmother would cook everything from scratch.
And then the neighborhood kids, he was such a big personality. Even though he was a dentist, he carried candy around. So they would see him, the neighborhood children, they would come run, Dr. Simon, and he'd give them chewing gum, not sugarless, like regular. He was always handing this out to them. And again, I was thinking, that's interesting. You were a dentist. Why are you giving all these kids candy?